We don't have all that much time, so I'm going to get straight into it. The Schlagentweit's expedition to India, it's not, how should I put it, it's not the most well-known of the scientific expeditions, and they're not the most well-known of the, I guess, German explorers or Indologists who were interested in this part of the world. A, how did you come across it? And B, why did you choose it, as a setting to kind of ground your novel in?
Well, that's a very good start. First of all, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you all for coming. I've been coming here for so many years, not only to India but also to Jaipur, and now it's very nice to be presenting a book here. So the question A is fairly easy to answer because I would just have to say my mother-in-law, because she was researching them, and so like for a while I knew about these Schlackenbaders who did like a lot of, one of the very biggest expeditions of the 19th century, but like even in Germany are not very known today, even though, Alexandre Dumas wrote about them in 5 of his novels, and so they were really known in their time, but nowadays nobody knows about them anymore. And but she was researching them, and a focus of her research, and so I knew about them for a while, but I didn't know how to write about them, because I didn't want to write about, it's like these 3 Bavarians from Bavaria who go to India. So like we have this guy who lives today, this Bavarian writer, again, who writes about brothers who are going to India, and I was like, I don't want to repeat that stuff. Like we could have written that in the 19th century. So I felt I have to find a new approach, and what I found so interesting about it was that in Germany we don't talk so much yet about the whole colonial aspect. I mean, Germany had colonies much later than some of the other colonial powers, but it became quite a big colonial power, and it was much briefer, and that's why in Germany the general perception is a lot of people don't even know that there were colonies, and if they know, they felt like, oh, it's just been a few years, what could we do, in just a few years? Well, it turns out they could do quite a bit. Bad stuff, I mean. And so I felt like how I found it so interesting to connect it with today, that you can see still a lot of things, a lot of problems that we have, or like and also in connection with South Asia that people don't see. But when you actually delve deeper into this whole story and topic, you realize that so many things, not only people have been colonized in other parts of the world, but also the colonizers have kind of colonized themselves, like colonization of the soul, as we often say, or the mind. And that people don't even realize what their worldview is, because it's coming from that time.
So another question. This kind of gets me to think. Now, this is a subject that a lot of people write about as anthropologists or as historians. Why did you choose a novel to explore a subject like this? I know, of course, it provides a fascinating setting and a fascinating set of questions to explore. But why did you choose a novel, and a novel like this, which has a major character of Bartholomew the orphan, through which to explore a subject this complex?
Well, I mean, first of all, because I'm a novelist, so I'm not an academic, and I felt that other people had already written about this in an academic sense about those brothers. What I wanted to do was more to give a little bit impression how that would feel, like the backstory is those brothers, but the perspective we have in the book is this 12-year-old orphan boy from Bombay who is, well, he's quite intelligent and he knows quite a lot of languages, and that's why those Schlackenweit brothers employ him for the whole journey. And the thing that he does is that he feels like, I have to turn this whole thing around. These guys always come to our country, they say like, this mountain is called like that, and this is called like that, and actually we were the first to climb on that mountain, even though this mountain has been there for quite a while. We don't know if you guys were actually the first ones to go on that mountain. So he feels like they define us in so many ways, and so he says like, okay, let me just turn it on and let me write this kind of scientific paper, which is the novel, and objectify those brothers. And so he analyzes these Schlackenweits, and he looks at them and says like, what are they wearing, how they're behaving, and he's treating them like objects. So the object is returning the favor in a sense. And I felt like that was the fun. I mean, that's what gave me the passion and the fun to write a book, because, you have to spend so much time with the book, so you need to have some, you have to fall in love in the beginning. It's like with if you're in a relationship, if you start very low, like where can it go? But you have to start high, because there will be trouble along the way. So in a way, I felt that really made me enjoy the whole story and to empower this little boy.
But why an orphan? Is an orphan, is he symbolic of something? Is he meant to symbolize, in a sense, a kind of India at that point in time, which is trying to, in a sense, rediscover itself?
Well, there are many
through
reasons.
its encounter with colonial modernity?
That's a very good answer, like in the intellectual sense, that's what I would give. But there's also like just a technical answer, because to be honest, if you have an orphan boy as your protagonist, you don't have to deal with the parents or the family. It's just a very practical solution, because otherwise everyone's like, oh, but why would he go on this journey, and why doesn't his mother say no, and where is his father, and then you have to have bad parents, but then you have to tell those parents again, and somehow have to get them out of the occasion. I mean, it's not a surprise that in a time when this novel takes place in the mid-19th century, there were quite a few novels written, like Dickens and so on, where the protagonists are orphans, and I think it's often just a practical solution. I mean, and up till today, like, I don't know, Harry Potter or so. So that is one reason. The other one is also that he had to be very young. I wanted him to be very young, because I really like the idea of this culmination of naivete on one hand that children, of course, have, but on the other hand of like a certain genius way or direct way of looking at things. Like he will say what he sees, and his view is not yet distorted, and plus he can get away with things. He's almost more like a court jester. You have someone who's around with a lot of influential and famous people in that time, and who criticizes them openly, and people say like, yeah, well, don't mind him, he's just a boy, like so. In that sense, he could be all the time present, and that's why I needed him to be also quite young.
Okay, no, that's extremely interesting. And Bartholomew, his character arc through the book, right? He undergoes what, to my mind, seems like quite a metamorphosis. So he starts out as this. He starts out in the orphanage. He's being bullied by the people he calls the others, and then his sort of protector dies, and that in itself is a fascinating story, because the subtext is the opium trade and what's happening with it, both in India and, of course, in China. But then Bartholomew undergoes this sort of transformation, and from there towards the end, he's almost holding the train together when they're on the expedition up in the mountains, when there's, and you set that part of the book near the mountain Nanda Devi, where, there's both a spiritual and a physical transformation. And is this transformation, again, something purely personal that he is undergoing and all the other characters are undergoing, or is this, in a sense, emblematic of what you think is a greater transformation in the run-up to 1857, which is also a subtext that's running through the plot?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Bartholomew stands also for a certain, like a group of people, and for a certain kind of emancipation, you could also say, that is happening with people, because what is very important to know about him is that in the beginning he thinks the world is clearly divided, like they're the Indians and they're the Ferengi, and the Ferengi, he means the British, and he calls the British not the British, he calls them the Wikis, because he feels like if they can name us anything, I can name them anything, and so Victorians, he calls them Wikis. And so he makes fun of them, and he feels like, okay, these are the bad guys, we are the good guys. And I think what he realizes more and more, growing older, because 3 years are happening there, but also, traveling and meeting so many people and experiencing so much, is that he realizes how messed up things are and how complicated things are, that there are people like this, Sir Jamsi Gigi Boy, who is like a major figure in the opium trade for the British, and who is the first Indian to be knighted. So he's also one of the bad guys in a way, but on the other hand, he will also meet some colonizers who are not just bad, but also do some good stuff. And I think he realizes, even with himself at some point, obviously, that, he thinks, I'm so Indian, but then he's like, oh, wait, my name is Bartholomew, and I'm writing this book in German, and I really believe in the idea of the museum. I want to create the first museum for India, meaning he wants to create something like the British Museum, a place where you go and you realize how powerful, how strong you are. So if Indians have this kind of museum, they go there, they know who they are, they don't need to listen to anyone else. So he has this idea, but only after a while, of course, realizing that, a museum is also quite a colonial institution. So all the things that already have been imbued to him, he realizes how, that he's neither this nor that, and that on many levels, actually. But I can't tell you all of that because that will be a major spoiler.
No, so this idea of museums is supremely interesting because, of course, he wants to model it on the British Museum, and as you say, the idea is that the Victorians only know themselves by reflecting on the museum to recognize who they are. But his museum is very different because his museum isn't drawing purely on objects. His museum is drawing on the written word. And his museum is he's creating the museum in the form of a diary that he's maintaining. And in a sense, it is to record his own impressions, but also, as you rightly said, to to define the world on his own terms. And do you think, in a sense, that writing in itself is a way of preserving not just impressions, but of preserving the world itself in a way that makes sense both to future generations and makes sense to how we perceive ourselves? So it was, is it in a sense an ode, you might say, to Indian writing or Indian self-definition that he's engaging in? Because he's Eurasian at the end of the day, and that is again a very, it's a big part of the subtext of your book. And I've written here because a lot of the things which seem quite simple are, in a sense, very deceptively simple because the canvas is so vast. So is this also meant to be a kind of way of preserving a Eurasian experience of India that kind of disappeared very, very quickly, really?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, he's like at the heart, like he's the culmination of like this, what you're describing, and he certainly is, it is kind of like a safe where you can read it, and but it's only I would say a perspective of this one person. I mean, because that's what we always have. In literature, we have like very subjective, very limited stories, which represent something larger, obviously, but we only see, of course, his very, very limited worldview. And even though he grows and even though he meets a lot of people, still it's quite limited. But at the same time, I feel like it can stand for a lot of things. I mean, for example, you could say he stands for all these people who've been always traveling with all these so-called explorers and who had never kind of had a voice, I'm not saying I'm giving them a voice now. It's not only up to me to do that. But, you usually hear about the explorers and what they did and all the great things or the dramatic things they did with them, machetes and whatever. But the guys traveling with them, they had a much harder time usually. So in that sense, so you have that. But I feel like even on a larger scale, I felt that there's something that I still deal a lot on like an everyday basis with, and that's also why I felt drawn to the story, is since my wife is from Delhi and I'm from Bavaria, so we often talk about this, and we used to talk about it quite frequently, and now that we have children, we talk about it even more so, because then you come across these things where you often feel like, so is there anything better? Like, what is your culture is doing this, my culture is doing this, can we meet there in the middle, and will our children be in the middle, or will they lean towards one way or the other? And then it's surprising what you find out where, what way is heavier, for example. So, but it's something that needs to be negotiated, and I think a lot of people are not too aware of it, even how mixed up things are already. They just maybe because it's of politics or so, but that we want to identify with one side, but like hardly any of us is on one side.
No, true. And that, I think, is really drawn out by the characters of the domestic staff, who I found incredibly interesting. There was, and especially the gardener, because the gardener, you meet him, at first he's lazy, he's indolent, he doesn't really do much work. He lives in a small tenement somewhere. And then he accompanies the train at some point, he disappears, and when you meet him again, he's completely transformed. He's, in a sense, a spy, a soldier, and the lives of these domestic staff that I think is something that you bring out very, very well. And is there something that that drew you to these characters?
Well, it's just
Are there any first-hand accounts of the expedition that, for example, drew you to the characters?
It's a mix. It's a mix, definitely. I mean, it's part of, like, you know, you never forget that I've written it. I mean, I feel like the book is almost more written for an Indian audience than a German audience, because in my experience, the book came out 2 years ago in Germany, and I had a lot of good experiences with it, but mostly the reaction is often, oh, that's all very interesting. I didn't know a lot of this. You know, it's very interesting. India. So it's like that's usually the gist of what people say. Whereas like I feel here is that there's more of a foundation of knowledge where you can build on. And so people read it and they recognize stuff immediately, or they could tell like, oh, this guy in the beginning that's actually quite a cliche of being like a gardener. You know, he's like lazy. He doesn't tend to the plants so much. And it's like what you can hear in every second colony in Delhi, I think. So anyway, so I felt like I always imagined my friends and the readers here reading the book. I didn't think so much about the Germans, because in my experience, I feel like I can impress Germans very easily with writing about India. You know, it's like I draw the line when a German knows that the Gandhi family is not related to that Gandhi, you know, like that's where I draw the line. Like when someone knows that, then I'm like, wow, people know quite a lot already. So that the knowledge is very, very little. And in that sense, I've always felt like if my aim was for this book that if people read it here, that they find like a certain complexity in it or a certain understanding. And of course, it was a certain risk also doing that, but that's why I wanted to, even with the more simple-minded characters as this guy, for example, I wanted to show the complexity of these people, because it's very easy. I feel like you just step on the street in India and you just anywhere you turn you can take there's something like I don't want to say colorful, but something very in your face where you can say, oh, you could write something about this, but it's just on the surface. And then to go actually a little bit deeper is, I feel, at least for a novel, the more interesting journey.
No, definitely. And well, we're down to our final minute, so I'll stop us there and we'll just go to the audience if someone has a question. Yes, please.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One, both of you spoke about the museum. Were you aware or inspired by the first museum that was established in India, and that was established here in Jaipur, in which a catalogue was brought out in 1883. The patron was the Maharaja,
Yeah.
and the art director and the curator was the civil surgeon, Colonel Henry. And his ideas seem to be the same as your protagonist, Bartholomew, to showcase India at its best to the world. My second question to you is, Bartholomew was your character when he German coming to India. Were you aware, or was he aware of the influence that Indian literature had on the Wehrmacht court, Goethe, Schiller, Max Miller? Those two questions.
Well, so I knew about the museum, but that's the whole deal. Of course, like even if you adapt the institution is of course still the idea was basically still colonial, and that's the whole interesting but also problematic aspect of it. So like even if you say like, okay, now we're gonna do politics in a certain way, like those people did it, you still, and we're gonna do it our way, you still adapt this principle. So that was what I found interesting about him. And of course he has a very naive idea of how he does it. He just feels like he puts everything in there, and I don't know if it works out for him in the end. You'll find out. And Bartholomew he's not from elsewhere. Like he grew up in Bombay, but so he is very fond of Indian literature. But that's again a thing he has been instilled already with a lot of Western ideas. So of course sometimes he feels like science is better in the West. He is not so aware of certain things, and only the longer he journeys, the more he realizes how complex certain things are, and how that he only looked at things in a certain way his whole life and suddenly realizes that there are many ways of looking at the same thing. And like, to just give you one example for that, in my own experience was, I think the very first time when I came to India, and before I got married to my wife, we went to a cafe in Delhi somewhere, and there was this world map on the wall, and I looked at the world map and I immediately thought, oh, it's such a strange world map. I'm like, of course, something Indian, they did something wrong with it, someone hung it wrong. And then I looked closer and I realized that South Asia was in the center. So, and then I was like, oh, so this is, and then I saw that Europe was like squashed away somewhere in the northwest, and it's like, it looked, like, just like you look at an Antarctica, so it's like, okay, it's there, but, who cares? And so, and that, I think that whole perspective change is something that people, for example, say in Europe, and especially also in Germany, are not used to. And that's also something, the transformation that Bartholomew goes through.